Hi, folks. This is meteorologist Don Paul on my YouTube channel, Don Paul WeatherPlus. Please subscribe. And our heat around here is just fairly typical. It's not what you would qualify as a heat wave, and we've got more coming. We mugify Friday night into Saturday, too. And then we get some relief with lower humidity on a very nice Sunday and pretty nice Monday coming up too. But I want to go to where a crisis is ongoing, and it's part of the climate change picture, which I still prefer to call mean global warming, because most of the climate change which is causing major impacts, besides being caused by humanity, is involving warming. This is a current European weather satellite visible image in true color at about the dinner hour across continental Europe. This is France, and there's Spain, and the atmosphere is just baking. We have a ridge of high pressure stacked up into the atmosphere. High pressure means it's weightier air, and there's sinking motion squishing the clouds. Haze can build up, but very little chance for any convection. And I'll show you a current upper level map over Europe, that stacked up ridge of high pressure. And you see that amplitude from this trough of low pressure over this enormous strong ridge back to a weak trough over southeastern Europe. This is a blocking pattern where west to east motion is locked up a great deal by the blocking ridge. And we're seeing this occur more often with the onset in the last 4 or 5 decades of Arctic warming, and I'll get to why that occurs. But blocking tended to occur before accelerated mean global warming, before warming, more often in the winter months, and now we're seeing it in the summer months as well, where blocking was largely responsible during May for frequent outbreaks of tornadic supercell thunderstorms in the same parts of the plains and into parts of Missouri as well. And blocking was responsible for the stalling of Hurricane Harvey close to Houston a couple of years back, $125 billion in flood damage. The main impact of that most expensive in history storm was from its flooding. And then Hurricane Florence was also modeled to stall and did due to this kind of pattern, just in different parts of the globe. And the warming in the Arctic is one of the two main, it's just about the main culprit. This is an image of this past season's ice maximum at the beginning of April. That is typically when Arctic ice has rebuilt to its maximum coverage. And you see this purple outline? That's where the median used to be a few decades ago. And this past ice maximum in early April was the least ice coverage for an ice maximum since records began being kept by satellite imagery in 1979. And I don't have the current image up here, but we are at a record low for this early in the season in late June. Since we started out with less ice than usual, it has been extraordinarily warm in Alaska and other parts of the Arctic near the Bering Sea. Russia has had some 80s close to the Arctic Ocean. And what happens when you start out with less ice than usual and have a longer warm season, you go from what used to be a longer season of reflective white ice sending heat back into space, replaced by dark ocean waters, which soaks up the heat. And that creates greater warming at the surface, not just over the Arctic Ocean, but over the surrounding land masses. We've had numerous reports of temperatures in the 80s this month in the interior of Alaska, not in Juneau, not right on the immediate seashore, but inland. Record warmth has been occurring. It's been occurring in many parts of Russia. And that warmth lessens the temperature contrast between the polar regions and the mid-latitudes down here. The less thermal contrast from here to here, the weaker the polar jet stream gets. And when the jet stream gets weak, it does that buckling thing with high amplitude. It's not a constant state, but it happens more often. And it's happening more often in the warm weather season. And that means we are experiencing more record warmth more often. Europe has had a terrible time of it in the last 15 years. Even last year, in Denmark and Sweden, more than 900 people died in a heat wave. There's very little air conditioning on the continent. National Geographic reports fewer than 5% of the homes in France are air conditioned, and fewer than 2%, less than 2% in Germany. And yet the heat is impacting. Yesterday, Thursday, the hottest temperature ever recorded in France, 111.7 degrees Fahrenheit. At one point in France, Paris has been in the mid and upper 90s again, other than jumping into a fountain. And there are air conditioned businesses, but the residences for nighttime relief, terrible heat stress builds up over days in these heated apartments, especially for infants and the elderly, night after night, where it just doesn't get cool enough to be able to get some sleep and allow your core body temperature to stay closer to average. So this is a real crisis, and here are the forecast temperatures just for this weekend from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. The darkest red here, that's on Celsius, 40 to 44. That's 104 to 111 degrees on the French Riviera, just about right up to the beach. And in other parts of the interior of France, we're looking at mid and upper 90s with very little wind. The winds are weak. Then we're seeing 100 plus degree temperatures have already been occurring in the interior of Spain. And not as much in Portugal, but Barcelona, cities getting temperatures of about 105 degrees. Again, reminding you the absence of any real air conditioning, and some real heat all the way past Germany into parts of Poland and northeast. You see the northeast section of Western Europe. And, last year some of this heat got up to here. And there's going to be worsening heat in parts of Italy and Sardinia in the next few days, in Greece, where heat waves have become more common. So I just want to remind people who have not necessarily paid close attention to why there is so much publicity about a warming climate. We know it is us. I don't mean Americans, I mean humanity, that have been the primary forcing mechanism for this. We can subtract on computer simulations the climate models if you initialize them with the CO2 levels we had around the year 1900, which was around 300 parts per million, compared to our current 410 to 415 parts per million, the world would have been cooling all this time. There are a couple of other things we can look at. The Earth's orbit is not a perfect circle. It is elliptical with some eccentricities. It has a wobble, which shows up about every 26,000 years, that's been associated with bringing on ice ages and bringing on big warm-ups. When people say, well, all these things used to happen before we were here, yes, but they were also associated with the Earth's orbital eccentricities and more CO2 being produced in nature. We know we are the ones producing the CO2 now. We're also adding to the methane load through agricultural practices. Yes, we need to grow stuff. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And animal agriculture is especially a big contributor. Then we have melting of the permafrost, releasing billions of tons of trapped CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, the seabeds. The oceans have absorbed 90% of the heat that is built up. So you can't even imagine what it would be like if the world were 3/4 covered with oceans, but there's a limit to how much the oceans can absorb. So with this ongoing situation slowly evolving into a real crisis, and I'll tell you, if you're walking around in these areas right now, it feels like a crisis. We have to do better than what we've been doing. I am not a visionary on fixes for how to reduce fossil fuel and greenhouse gas emissions. That's not my area of expertise. But I've also been seeing, and I'll bet some of you have seen too, on Facebook, a report that was issued a few days ago predicting essentially extinction by the middle of the century of humanity. And I can tell you this much after having looked into it a bit. The authors of that alarmist study are just that, alarmists. They are not a part of the mainstream scientific community. Their academic backgrounds are inadequate to make such wild eyed predictions. And that is not only not the consensus of climate scientists and physicists, there's virtually nothing to that kind of extreme event unfolding in that short a period of time, if ever. I don't know of many climate scientists who are predicting extinction from that, even when we get to the next century. But we are in trouble, and the trouble is amplifying. And so we need to find ways to reduce our output of greenhouse gases, which have their own feedback mechanisms. The more warming you get, the more evaporation you get from the oceans and the lakes. More water vapor in the atmosphere also acts as a greenhouse gas. In addition to it leading to more heavy precipitation events, as occurred in the plains in May, that added water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So it additionally brings warming on top of the warming from CO2 and methane. And it also has this ongoing increased frequency of blocking events, which are going to cause some more extreme heat. We typically now have 2 record highs for every 1 record low annually in the Northern Hemisphere. That's proof positive that we have ongoing warming. A stable climate would have a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, you can have some, in the past, when man-linked warming wasn't the main cause for the warming which occurred in years such as 1931, 34, and 36, you can have a year or two where there are some real extremes due to natural variability. But this has been going on for decades. And, the European continent has weather records going back earlier than ours do. And 5 of Europe's warmest summers on record have occurred in the last 15 years. And last year, 900 plus deaths in Sweden and Denmark from a heat wave. 2010, 56,000 Russian premature mortality reports, and the worst heat wave on record, and a lot of the mortality was in France. Again, lack of air conditioning. More than 70,000 people died from extensive and lengthy heat waves during the summer of 2003. And again, you can say, well, it's their choice not to have air conditioning. That's true, but there are also vast parts of the world, northern India, where air conditioning isn't an option. There simply isn't the economic basis to have it. And if we had a huge increase in the use of air conditioning, while it certainly could mitigate these crises as they're ongoing, it's also going to lead to the burning of more fossil fuels at this time at our level of technology. And the Europeans seem very conscious about that. They've made their choices, and they're paying for them to some extent. But you don't see large SUVs driving around London, and you don't see them in Paris. So this is a problem for which there is no quick fix. But for anyone who thinks we are already past a tipping point where nothing further can be done, there is still enormous evidence that there still can be a best case scenario by late this century, which still has just tremendous negative impacts on agricultural productivity and public health. Best case scenario worse versus the worst case scenario, which would be calamitous with a tremendous increase in mortality and famine. There are still ways to keep this to a relatively nasty but livable minimum. So that's my editorial for today. I am not the ultimate pessimist. I'm just trying to give you the perspective that I've seen in doing a lot of researching on this topic. And we should give thanks here locally that we still have never touched 100 and are unlikely to do so. We've got it pretty good around here, folks. And I think you know that. Talk to you soon.